Good morning and welcome to the webinar on scaling AMR innovations. And in this webinar, we will be focusing on availability and access. CCAM, as most of you know, the Center for Cellular and Molecular Platforms is today India's most exciting and most vibrant ecosystem for innovation and entrepreneurship. We're based in Bangalore and today very proud to have a portfolio of over, I would say, close to 500 companies that we have supported through incubation, through mentoring, through our entrepreneurship development programs, and of course, funding. And delighted also to have some of today's, so I would say leading startups as part of our portfolio. Today's webinar is being organized as part of the CARBEX Global Accelerator Network that CCAM has been selected as. CCAM got selected to be part of this, about 6 world-class global accelerators from across the world. CCAM is the only one outside of North America and Europe to be selected for this. And through the CARBEX GAN, we do a lot of activities in AMR. Before we begin, I just would like to mention that CARBEX, of course, supports all the programs that we run. CARBEX is the world's, probably the world's largest or probably second largest not-for-profit organization that funds innovations in antimicrobial resistance, and they also provide scientific and business expertise. As I mentioned, we are a set of 6 world-class global accelerators around the world that support the development of new antibiotics and other life-saving products to fight drug-resistant bacteria. Just a small disclaimer, the content of today's webinar and presentations is supported by CARBEX. CARBEX's funding is sponsored by the Cooperative Agreement Number IDSEPI 630 from ASPR and BARDA, and by awards from the Wellcome Trust, Germany's Federal Ministry of Education and Research, the UK Global Antimicrobial GAMRIF, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the content is solely the responsibility of the authors and does not necessarily reflect or represent the official views of CARBEX or its funders. So with this disclaimer in place, I would like to welcome and introduce our speakers for today. We have on the panel Dr. Jaideep Gopte. He is the Global Chief Medical Officer at CIPLA. He completed his medical graduation, his MBBS degree from Grand Medical College and Sir J.J. Group of Hospitals in Mumbai, and MD in Pharmacology from the St. G.S. Medical College and KEM Hospital. He joined CIPLA in 1994, and as we were just chatting, his first job, so he's been with CIPLA, joined CIPLA soon after, I guess, he finished his MD. And has been closely involved in the development and introduction of several drugs in various therapeutic fields, especially in HIV/AIDS, infectious diseases, and respiratory diseases. He has worked on several clinical trials in the field of asthma and COPD infections, and has also spoken at various national and international events. Welcome, Dr. Gopte, and thank you for joining us today. Our other panelist on the webinar today is Dr. Dhananjay Dendukuri, who is the CEO and co-founder of Achira Labs Private Limited. Dhananjay did his BTech from IIT Madras and PhD from MIT in chemical engineering. He returned to India with a passion for engineering and the belief that technology development for underserved markets must be done locally. He worked as a lead scientist in Connexius before starting his own company, Achira, and over the years has built a team as well as good products for diagnostics, and has gained experience with fundraising, the commercial aspects, operational and regulatory aspects of building and taking diagnostic technologies to the market. So welcome, Dr. Dhananjay. Good to have you on the panel today. We have Dr. Taslim Arif Sayed, who is the CEO and Director of CCAM. I'm sure most of you know Taslim and would have interacted with him at some point of time in your, during your entrepreneurship, because he's very, very passionate about entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship. His initial training has been in neurosciences, and he received his PhD from the Max Planck Institute for Brain Research in Germany, and followed it up with postdoctoral training at UCSF. He also underwent training in management for biotech and innovation from QB3, which is at UC Santa Cruz, UC Berkeley, and UC San Francisco. He is actively involved in promoting innovation and life sciences, healthcare, by supporting translation of discoveries to application, entrepreneurship, and technology development. Thanks, Taslim. Just wanted to point out to an event that we are doing tomorrow in Delhi. If any of you happen to be in Delhi, please do register. But I would also like to just quickly introduce the topic, sort of briefly, or put the, in context that we're looking here to address scaling AMR innovations, and would be focusing on availability and access. The idea is to, we all know that AMR is a huge challenge, and it's important that diagnostic tests to detect the infection and drugs to treat those infections are available where they are needed the most. So our panel today will discuss various aspects of these. Request Taslim to take this forward. Thanks, Taslim.
Thank you very much, Nandita, and good morning, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to have you all with us, and of course with very esteemed panelists today for this very important aspect to discuss over the next 45 minutes to an hour at max about AMR innovations. I think we all broadly know, just if I may set the context very clearly in terms of what we are hoping to do. We all know the severe threat that AMR has looming in front of us. Globally, the AMR, and if you have followed, most of you who are aware of the field, if you followed the publication in the Lancet, the numbers are absolutely stunningly, disastrous. And if you actually know that if these are underrepresented based on the estimates which are built and so on, if the numbers are even worse, we are actually looking at something, nothing but a healthcare tsunami, as we call that. And we all have to possibly work together from various aspects to ensure that we can bring the tone of the tsunami down. The projections of the AMR, as we know, it's already almost causing 2 million deaths per year. And this is going to go towards 10 or even, unfortunately, possibly more in next 20 odd years. So the 10 to 12 million deaths, it's almost like taking a small country out of the globe or the map every year. And that is absolutely stunning. Even worse, if you see from LMICs, are the numbers that are coming in neonatal sepsis. These are even very, very unfortunate. The numbers suggest that we are losing a very high number of neonates if they acquire sepsis in the LMICs for many factors that are involved, and that number is very high. And we have to work together to ensure this young deaths, the neonates death and death in general actually are prevented. The AMR burden is prevented and so on. And while we all work at it, there are many efforts, we all know about it. Globally, there are significant efforts. And you just heard from the Global Health Assembly, World Health Assembly, which just happened. Dr. Tedros, in his speech, did mention extensively about the issue of AMR. So what are we discussing today? I think there are several, exciting work happening to ensure that the AMR can be attacked from different sides. One thing that we all know that has to happen now is that this building of new AMR innovations, be it preventative, be it diagnostic, be it therapeutic of all kind, need to also be ensured that they scale up. their access actually goes to the level that is needed. The scale actually goes to the level so that the impact of the intervention is meaningful. Otherwise, the efforts done at smaller scale and early stage may not yield results that we all are looking for. So today, with Dr. Gokte and Dr. Dhananjay, if I, in the ease of time, if I just go by the first name, Jaideep and Dhananjay, we would like to discuss with them the two different perspectives of how do they see the challenges and the possibilities of scaling up of AMR innovations. When we say scale up, I just wanted to reiterate, it is not a scale up of a product, but also in terms of its access, in terms of its reach, in terms of its larger impact. And I think one perspective would come from a larger corporate like Cipla, which has done a phenomenal work in infectious disease. We all know about it. I don't think I had to repeat Cipla's contribution in infectious disease, and more so and clearly in HIV therapeutics and so on. I think it's completely groundbreaking historical contribution that Cipla has made over decades in terms of ensuring that people do get worldwide people get the access of the therapeutics for that. So that is a corporate large organizational view in terms of what they look at it from there. And the second view that we will be possibly looking at is from one of the most exciting startup that has happened over the last 8 odd years. CCAM has had the honor to actually support them at the idea level, and then be with them over years and see them grow and do well at scale. So we would look at that. But I think just to step back to say that what we hope to do is that have 2 or 3 larger thoughts locked in after this session, so that people can possibly take those views and chew over it and take those journeys as a new information, new understanding, new perspectives to build that up. I think that is a larger goal of today's session. So thank you both for joining in. And of course, Nandita and Roshan, who have built this amazing session. Thank you for that. So let me begin with this context. Let me begin with having a first round of this session by asking each panelist on their perspective on the larger aspect of AMR innovations. Possibly they could begin with the larger, how they see AMR, how they see AMR innovations, and then possibly how they want to look at it from the scaling of innovation. So if I may begin with Jaideep for now. Jaideep, your views, please. Thank you.
So Tasneem, first, thank you very much to you and the team at CCMP for the kind invitation. Very happy to be here. In the area which is, of course, close to very Cipla is infectious disease. We have been carefully looking at AMR for the past 5 or 6 years, particularly as more and more data has been coming, not just from India, from other parts of the world. And I think our perspective would be as follows. One, we know that the scale of the problem is truly phenomenal. There is no doubt about that. And I think you've highlighted figures from the recent Lancet paper which talk about direct mortality attributable to AMR and possibly associated with AMR. And we're touching figures probably of 5 or 6 million if we add the two. Second, the highest numbers actually come from, unfortunately, Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, the low and middle income countries, and then perhaps to some extent from Eastern Europe and then other countries. Fourth, and I'll briefly talk on anti-infectives, because that's obviously my more area of expertise. The development of new antibiotics to target some of the difficult and resistant pathogens, unfortunately, still continues in Western countries, where the actual number of people who have these resistant infections may be relatively small. It's not zero, obviously, it's relatively small. And by the time some of these anti-infectives come to countries like India or Africa, it can take 10 years. And let me actually give you an example. In the last about 7 or 8 years, about 13 or 14 new antibiotics or antibacterials have been approved by the FDA. Barely one of them has made it to India, and perhaps a few other LMICs. Most of the others, and almost all the others, have not made it to either India or made it to other countries. So to me, it's the same situation as what was in HIV. The drugs, and this is a very famous statement which was made by a professor from Uganda, that he said that drugs are where the disease is not, and the disease is there where the drugs are not. So I think we are having a very familiar situation again playing out, where we have a lot of difficult infections today, and we are scrambling to do best what we can. So I think there's a big gap there, and one of the areas of looking at when you talk about scaling up is to how to make sure that perhaps these new antibiotics come out here as well. But I think there are other areas also of AMR innovation access, and I'm sure Dhananjay will talk about diagnostics, which I will therefore not cover. But there are other things also. For example, could you have decision support trees which tell us whether the infection is viral or bacterial, to reduce the use of antibiotics for bacterial infection, viral infections? In fact, we do know that most of the antibiotics are used when patients have upper respiratory infection is actually viral. Is there something that can easily help tell the physician you don't need to use an antibiotic or you need to use for here? So in addition to new drugs, which are innovations, in addition to new diagnostics, which could be, I'm sure Dhananjay will touch on point of care, I think there are equally clinical support systems for a physician to decide whether I need to use an antibiotic or not. And if at all I need to use antibiotic, which one should I use? So I'm sure there's a lot of work happening in that part, which talks about artificial data and machine learning to get data from hospitals and community to try and build up or help physicians have a decision support tree for antibiotics. So we have a huge problem. I think we have opportunities to address it. I think the real bug is how do we get these new innovations into the larger world where they're truly required. And let me stop at there and hand it over back to you, Leslie.
Thank you. No, very interesting. I think you straight on brought one of the largest challenge in terms of access, and I think you gave an example of the recent antibiotics and its availability in India, possibly. And at the same time, I think it is much more grave because possibly India is facing one of the highest number of, AMR caused deaths as well. So I think that is a huge, and I think it goes back to your example of what Uganda professor said, availability of drugs is not there where the disease is, and something that in terms of access has to, do. I think it's particularly we will elaborate on that further, but very, very important component from a therapeutics perspective. And, I think you have opened the dialogue very much wide open with this statement. So let me go to now Dhananjay on that for now. And Dhananjay, your perspectives, you please feel free to go to diagnostics, of course, something that Achira Labs is doing phenomenally well, but also please feel free to, dabble into broader aspects of AMR innovations as well. Dhananjay, over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Tasleem, Nandita, and Roshan for inviting me, first of all. And I believe that, first of all, AMR has got a lot more prominence, as we all know, and everyone is talking about the Lancet publication. I haven't heard someone talk about a publication so much, which I think is a good thing. It's really entering a lot of dialogues. In fact, we were in Berlin last week for an AMR workshop, and I believe that in addition to climate change and COVID, AMR was being introduced as a third agenda item for G7 prime ministers and so on. So it's achieving that sort of importance, which is, I think, a good thing given the scale of the problem we are facing. From the diagnostics point of view, a few things that I'd like to say. Number one is, diagnostics, I think everyone acknowledges now, is very central to the AMR problem. It is not something peripheral, but it's something very important to the good use of antibiotics. I think no one disputes that. And at the same time, we have a challenge that from a business point of view, from a commercial point of view, diagnostics are expensive, oftentimes more expensive than drugs. And hence, there is a specific problem in LMIC countries that how do we then actually get to use these diagnostics from an access and affordability point of view? How can they become lower than the price of the drugs? I think this is one big challenge that we have. From the regulatory point of view, I believe that today the accepted reference standard methods for a lot of the AMR problems are still a culture antibiotic sensitivity tests. However, from the future, looking at the future, I think molecular diagnostics, looking at resistance genes, looking at species identification is probably the future in terms of just the speed with which you'll get the result. But being able to then compare these two and then actually say that you are as good as the reference standard, I think from a clinical trial point of view, this is a fairly complex issue in itself. So that needs something that needs to be carefully looked at. From a development point of view, I would say both faster culture methods to do faster AST tests, basically, as well as molecular diagnostics. These are probably the two most promising approaches in AMR. And I think one of the complexities with the molecular approach is that you have a lot of polymicrobial infections. So we're involved, for example, in a project to characterize diabetic foot ulcers. And the vast majority of these infected wounds actually are polymicrobial, So there is a certain complexity that brings in terms of species identification, as well as tagging the resistance genes to the specific species, because it's not just about knowing which resistance gene, but also in the context of which species. So there's a lot of information that needs to be gathered by the appropriate technologies and then finally actually connected to the clinic. And one of the challenges I think often faced is the doctors want to know what can we use, but a lot of diagnostics seem to say what you cannot use, right? So being able to connect these two pieces of information and really give the clinician this answer that what should I be using, that in itself is an information processing challenge that needs to be met. Finally, one broader point about beyond diagnostics, I think just training of healthcare workers, training of nurses, administrative staff in the ICU settings, and sanitation protocols in hospitals. This is something that comes up a lot. It's just a baseline problem that needs to be solved. People have shown remarkable results in India, even just through appropriate maintenance of some of these protocols. So I believe from a holistic point of view, all these things need to be looked at.
Oh, thank you, Dhananjay. I think very, very important. And I think you picked up a very important aspect. I think early diagnostics is a key. And we all understand how the diagnostics is becoming crucial in terms of, AMR treatment for selection of antibiotics, which is, key. And I think we are still largely stuck with a very conventional, very traditional culture-based thing, which still takes 48 to 72 hours. I think we haven't cut it down in last 2, 3, 4 decades. And I think many efforts are going on to bring this down by 1/2, 1/3, or even less, as we all know. And I am fairly optimistic individually that I think we'll have we'll have multiple options available on table in next 3 to 5 years, which will have address it in different ways in different geographies because of different contexts that different geographies have. And that's what again brings into prospect of geographic centric availability and access, right? This brings down again, because there'll be many, and I'm just using your note to say that you and of course possibly want to connect back to Jaideep's point, but let's say something phenomenal comes out in molecular diagnostics, which actually understands it within half an hour, an hour. We know the Longitude Prize is attempting to do something, say half an hour AST and take 10 million pounds home, right? More or less something of that nature. Now, but we do know that it hasn't happened, and there are many efforts going on, but we do know that it hasn't happened. But if that happens, and we do hope that happens, would technology be so sophisticated that possibly it may not be available in LMICs, right? It would be so expensive. It would not be possibly to be affordable in LMICs. And the infrastructure required, the capital investment required may be completely prohibitively suited for LMI. So that's where I think how as an ecosystem should look to fetch best of the technology, not only for global north, but also for a larger world at large, right? In a way. And that is an important dialogue to have and pull mechanism to ensure that these innovations are available to global north and global south, if that's the terminology people want to use. So I think this is where I think the access and availability comes into picture. If I may go back to Jaideep here. Jaideep, you did mention very clearly the unavailability of new antibiotics in India, and clearly including some of the work in TB and some of the other work which we are heavily impacted. We do know that a lot of work has happened over that. If you can expand on it in terms of why this happens and what are the larger reasons that this happens, and your view, how this could possibly be eased to ensure that much more availability and access of this comes. Is it to do with the policies at the government level, Is it to do with the market component, the pull? Is it the pricing strategy? Is it distribution and supply chain? Is it availability of raw material? Just some thoughts from you, Jerry.
Certainly, Steve. I think if we look at what's really happened in the last 10 or 15 years, so let me go back a little earlier. I recall more than 15 years ago, the Infectious Disease Society of America published a report, and I distinctly remember reading that report. Maybe it is close to 18, 20 years, which said that bad bugs, no drugs. So this was a report. And the reason why they put out this report is because Big Pharma had completely got out of anti-infectives. Discovery and development, was only sort of being relegated to startups. And therefore, there was a time when for a decade, we practically had no new antibiotics. And then, of course, there was a big rally from government funding. Of course, people like Carbex, BARDA really set up funding mechanisms for drug development. And therefore, we did see some breakthroughs. I wouldn't say terrific breakthroughs, but we did see some very encouraging signs that people were working on new antibiotics. But unfortunately, what's happened, it's, how finance people look at it, or Wall Street looks at this is, and I'll give this interesting insight, which I saw 2 or 3 years ago at a conference on World AMR, which said that as long as the antibiotic is under development, the share price of the company is quite high. But the moment it gets approved, the share price falls. I mean, where do you see this? Right? Normally, your share price should go up if a drug is approved. But the money that needs to be spent on commercializing a product is currently what is missing. Only the big pharma can afford it. Startups cannot afford it. And so I know that Cipla, we ourselves have a branded new antibiotic which we acquired in the US, which is plazomicin, a third new generation aminoglycosides. It's challenging to commercialize it because there's so much data generation, surveillance, which are mandatory, needs to be done. So what happens to many startups who have actually developed new drugs is they don't really understand is that they're not able to really commercialize and get return on investment that they've done. So for them, countries like LMICs, etc., are really far away. So one of the things that we have tried to mention in many forums, especially to startups who are in phase 2, phase 3, I said, bring countries like India, South Africa, other early on in your drug development phase. So if you bring countries like India early on, then automatically once the product is approved by the FDA or EMA, it could immediately get licensing in India and few other countries. So you're not sticking to just one country, you're sticking to multiple countries, including where the infection or the resistance rate is the highest. That's one. Second, I think even if there are drugs only approved by the EMA or the FDA, and let's say companies like Cipla or other companies want to bring them to India, you obviously have to go through the process of getting your dossier approved by the regulatory authorities. So currently in India, the recommendation is to do a phase 3 clinical trial of an appropriate sample size with a standard comparative agent. And I can tell you, clinical trials in anti-infectives are quite challenging, unlike, let's say, the other treatments. Like most of the patients who get enrolled in the trial, the culture often comes negative because they've taken some antibiotic in the past with a GP or something like that. So there are lots of issues in actually running such studies in India and other countries. So perhaps there could be an opportunity for government to consider this as a high unmet medical need. Look at the profile, look at the PK perhaps of the drugs in India, in the Indian population, and have a more accelerated pathway towards approval in India, at least, and across India. As far as LMICs are concerned, you can always take the US FDA approved dossier and file it. They don't require any additional. But startups do not have the infrastructure to go to these countries and actually do it. So I think there's a lot of partnership and collaboration that is required from, let's say, generic kind of companies like us to partner with innovator companies to bring their products to this part of the world. Equally so, I think developing drugs in our own setting is good, and I am happy to really encouraged by people like Bugbooks who are actually doing some work doing discovery in India itself. So these are perhaps only few things I can mention at the moment about production. Of course, will always be an issue, but India's, I have to say, pretty good as far as manufacturing goes. And in fact, for many large companies whom we talk to, we say, why don't you bring your manufacturing to India? It would be much cheaper to make a drug in India, both the API as well as the formulation. India makes thousands of generic drugs. There should be no dearth of talent in India to develop these drugs. So as you are developing these drugs, you can actually transfer technology to India so that eventually the cost of goods falls which would make it profitable for that company in the US as well as in other countries. So I think there's some part of understanding that can be improved upon and building up some of these collaborations. But I have to say at the end of the day, Raslim, and I'm sorry for having such a long answer, that there has to be some return on investment for every company. Right? And it may not be huge, like maybe on other products, but there has to be a visible return on investment. Like in the US, Carbex, BARDA have given a lot of push incentives, but there are no pull incentives right now, except in the UK that we just saw, the first subscription model for 2 antibiotics, Pfizer and Shionogi's. So there are no pull incentives for people to actually bring antibiotics to the market or commercialize them. Push are plenty, as we have seen. So I'll just stop here and leave it to you.
No, thank you. Thank you. Very, very, very appropriate. And I think one thing that clearly stands out is, how it would be planned early on. And I think just if I say your last comment, I think if I'm not wrong, the recent announcement from NHS allows to straight on, I think, if I'm not wrong, 2 antibiotics to be, a mainstream and build the entire model to ensure that. So I would like to come back to you, but let's do it. I think, Jaideep, what is your view? How is that model according to you? And is it
interesting? Maybe Dhananjay, you may have heard it recently in your meeting in Europe. But what I did read in detail is that based on a cost-effective analysis or societal effectiveness and all that kind of analysis, very complex analysis, 2 antibiotics were selected. One is ceftazidime-avibactam of Pfizer and cefiderocol of Shionogi. There would be I think, equivalent to about £10 million payout each year, irrespective of the number of doses that are consumed. And I think that's for the next 5 years or 10 years. I don't recall exactly. But, to the manufacturer, there is a certain assured income or return on investment, let me say, whether a product really is. So it's like stockpiling. Look what we are doing for COVID, right? We are stockpiling things. When we had this pandemic that was going to break out of influenza during many years ago, swine flu, people stockpiled tons and tons of oseltamivir. I know even Cipla stockpiled APR. Some of it was never used. But the idea was that governments bought it, right? And somebody rightly said that we all buy weapons in the hope that we'll never have a war, right? Never have a war. But here, there's an opportunity to perhaps stockpile, I'm just saying in inverted commas, some of these antibiotics or anti-infectives. So there is a return on investment for the company. And you may or may not fully use this. But how do you otherwise create that pull mechanism or incentive mechanisms for companies to continue to invest and work in antibiotics? So I think this is the first example. I thought there is some light at the end of the tunnel. There are several, other legislations in place in the US called as the Pasture Act and others, Disarm Act, but they've been there for a long time. And maybe there is some learnings for even countries like India and parts of Africa to actually study, to see how this can be encouraged.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think when I read about that, I think it was a very, forward-looking model, according to me, because the pharmaceutical world, in terms of antibiotic development, it's stuck in terms of commercialization aspect of the new antibiotic. And as is something like this, where the developers or the manufacturers and the, if I may use the word, the government, who has to look up after the healthcare aspect of the society or the country, look across, sit across the table and possibly say that, see, this is what it takes. And if there are no guaranteed, options available for us, we may not further go, and this will stop. And when you will need it, when the fire will come, it will not be, I cannot open the factory overnight, right? And that is something, a game that has to be understood to keep it running. And I think that's the cost. Possibly as a whole, the world has to see whether this is the amount of cost that has to keep our effort running to ensure the lower the AMR burden, to lower the mortality that we are unfortunately seeing, spiking significantly. I think it's very interesting, and it would be wonderful to see how one can argue around this with the Indian government and say that, we are big enough country, our loss will be even bigger, and how do we actually see that bring in those developers here and say, no, you must do it. Something that we possibly did it in HIV significantly. We did it. So I think we need possibly an analogic view or analogic model of that to actually do that, and something we'll come back to. But coming to Dhananjay, your view, do you think the best of the diagnostics in terms of AMR innovations, availability and access, what are the challenges in those in different parts of the world, not necessarily LMIC and developed countries perspective always, but in general, and how do you see those panning out from a developers perspective?
Yeah. So in terms of diagnostics, I think first of all, maybe we should separate out diagnostics that are useful in a hospital context, which need to be timely, but even in this context, within 5-6 hours would be considered very timely given the alternatives. And the point of care screening type of tests, which maybe should be available, let's say for a UTI, which is a very common thing in a doctor's office setting, right? So you have, I think, diagnostics at both ends of this spectrum. For the more sophisticated hospital context where you're really trying to save a patient in an ICU and decide whether to give, let's say, a drug which has serious side effects, for example, you want a lot of information in your hands. That can be very sophisticated. That can cost a little bit. I think the value of that information is very high. It's really saving a life at that point. But however, you might have to really give a lot of information, let's say, on both species and resistance genes, etc. And at the other end, you want a typical, like a point of care device, which is more portable, which is easy to perform, and which is able to at least give you, is first of all, is this bacterial or viral? That's the lowest level of testing. And then above that, even, something about what kind of a bug it is, or at least higher level species classification, something like that. So you need, I think, to look at these two problems differently. Not everything needs to be a portable point of care device. And then the other complexity, I think, really in the AMR problem in terms of diagnostics is that you have several different sample types to consider, right? It could be a respiratory, it could be a swab, it could be a blood sample for sepsis, it could be a wound sample for something like a foot ulcer. And one of the technical challenges in a lot of diagnostics development is each of those sample types actually is a significantly different test development in terms of the sample prep development, which often is actually the complex part of many of these diagnostics. So I think, as you said earlier, Tasneem, yourself, you will need multiple efforts, probably focused on each one of these clinical problems. It's not going to be a one-size-fits-all that helps. Lastly, in terms of diagnostics, I would say surveillance. Again, COVID has brought up the importance of surveillance testing, testing sewage and so on. And actually, I think similarly, surveillance testing of hospitals, at least at some population level, looking at what's coming out of a hospital and seeing what kind of bugs are actually growing there. That could actually be very relevant to how that hospital is being managed. So there could be those kinds of diagnostic tests even, which are actually quite important.
Oh, thank you, Dhananjay. I think very important, and I think you brought out cruciality of, of course, achieving the broader aspect of surveillance, and if I may just put in, stewardship as well, how diagnostics and the as well as the careful use of antibiotics could actually allow us to do that. One of the aspects, and before I open up, I think in a few minutes we'll go to questions, some of the questions which are coming in, or specific questions if there are more. But one of the point that is largely from a developer's perspective, if I may just change it, we were talking about two, but if I may just change it now. The developers, when, in India more so, and many friends who have joined us today, in India still developers come from a very strong scientific, leaning, aspects. So there is a strong scientific aspect to it. But as they grow in, build a proof of concept, do the validation studies, go towards further advancements, and of course, from a therapeutic perspective, they will have to be at the global scale to ensure that growth is built in. While at the diagnostic stage, possibly you could actually still do a lot of that in India, looking at the regulatory aspects, CE, ISO, further DCGI approval and FDA approval and all that. But how should product developers, I think, should look at it, where they are between the proof of concept and at the same time between the as one would call it, the final market, because
Right.
they need to plan it very well, that what they want to do. And I think something that Jaideep mentioned in his earlier comments, that these guys should already keep the India, Africa's and others in their planning while they do that for the drug developers. But how about diagnostic people? Because otherwise what is happening is that diagnostic, and this is some, seeing from at least other perspective, but what is happening is there is a development happening, there is product being brought out, but crucial aspect of making those impactful in terms of the intervention in the healthcare sector, there is some level of stagnation that happens. And we have to decode what that is. And is it because of the reasons like what we mentioned, policy level, pricing aspect, governmental engagement, and so on? What do you think of that, Dhananjay?
I think there are two things that we should be careful about here. One is, involvement of microbiologists and doctors early on in the process is probably very important, because ultimately they are going to, agree to use this test or not. So if they don't believe in the value of whatever is being developed, you don't have a chance in the market. I think so, as early as possible for any developer, bringing in those folks, microbiology, MD Path kind of people who are running these hospital labs, they need to be involved in the process. Secondly, I think in terms of the, what shall I say, the business model, we've all already discussed that you need to have a strong case. And I think, Asleem, you yourself know there's several people who have looked at AMR over the last decade, lower cost diagnostics and so on, and everyone comes up against this quick wall that there's a 100 rupee culture test available, basically from a small lab's point of view. That how do you really ever compete with that? So I think one broad answer has been, okay, let's go to a context which can pay, like a hospital recurrent infection, etc. So you kind of have to start at the top of the tree in that sense. Even though eventually we all want to go to very widespread diagnostics, the payability might be in these more niche scenarios where you're actually saving a life. So I think, especially in the Indian context, given that it's mostly going to come out of pocket, choosing the test and choosing the clinical context is also very important early on for the developer. And finally, I would say from a regulatory point of view, if a faster AST could just be compared against existing culture, but let's say you have a molecular diagnostic and somebody's taking the reference of culture, right, in a clinical trial, then there could be all sorts of complexities in that, right? So how do you deal with that tomorrow when you're doing an actual trial and submitting to regulator? Do we have the tools to actually convince and prove our case, especially in some complex polymicrobial type of context?
No, thank you. And I think very clearly, I think understanding of positioning is also very important. Something, if I may say, how do you want to position your product as you go forward, and how you want to build the early clinical studies to ensure that those actually get validated against that particular disease protocol intervention, because you will have to position it somewhere and show that there is a remarkable difference that it makes for the larger ecosystem and the practitioners to embrace it of sorts. And it's very, very important thing in terms of clinical study, not only for efficacy, but clinically study in terms of positioning in them. The protocol is also very, very crucial. And I think sometimes we miss that component and go with push that I need to get it out. But how do you actually position that is very crucial in terms of its scale and its availability at large. But last question before we go on to the questions from friends who have joined us and who are there. To Jaideep, I remain wanted to come back to that aspect, and of course we'll get a chance to talk about it. But while we are together, let's attempt to see, what do you see if I don't know whether I'm fascinated by the CIPLA's contribution in HIV/AIDS therapeutics. So possibly I'm going back to that, but they did really do a phenomenal job in terms of changing the gear, bringing out the generics aspect of it, and making it cost effective, making it available, accessible of sorts. And right now, if this very expensive, we are really chasing the question both ways, but if antibiotics become expensive of sorts, how do you see those then being available to patients who can't afford it? and think it from a product developer's perspective, because then their market is being restricted. So how do you see that for now?
Let me, try and answer your question, Taslim, a little differently. One of the problems why we have landed up in this AMR has been both lack of access and excess. It's a very unusual problem that we have, that if you don't have enough antibiotics, the bugs get a chance to replicate, multiply, and also therefore have increased risk of resistance. If you have too much of antibiotics as well, equally the same thing happens. Because of selection pressure and other things, you get resistance. So I think to strike a good balance between the two, as to what should a new antibiotic, for example, be priced at. Right? Let's take an example of that. If you look at some of the new antibiotics that have come to India, which are used in the hospital setting or the intensive care, maybe they're about 10 or 15,000 rupees per day cost of treatment. Now that's out of reach for most people who get admitted to public hospitals. Right? There's no way they can afford 10, 15,000 rupees. Many of them are uninsured people. So there's no easy answer for this. But I do believe that one of the things that Dhananjay did mention about surveillance, I think is very important. While I do know that Indian Council of Medical Research has now a network of hospitals where they do surveillance, I think if we expand that network to not just include the private and the public sector tertiary care hospitals, but also to the middle level 50, 100 bedded nursing homes, because sometimes there is no clear way as to how antibiotics should be used in those hospitals. Unlike in many of the large hospital chains, there are some protocols in place, I believe. There's an antibiogram, there is a hospital-based surveillance mechanism that happens. But if you go to the mid-sized hospitals, this probably doesn't happen. And in the community, probably not at all. So there is no easy answer to saying how can we improve access of new antibiotics at a right price, right, without having background information of all this. But to answer your question, I do believe that one way to actually, I won't always use the term bring down prices, but to actually make sure that the prices are in the right way is try and manufacture or develop the manufacturing within India, for example, for India, and not just depend on, and you can always start with importing, but eventually do a tech transfer to India and make it here. And then the pricing can be decided perhaps with a group who look at the overall health economic benefits rather than just the price of the drug and the raw material costs. Today many of the antibiotics are so low priced, incredibly low priced, right? You look at fluoroquinolones, for which we have the maximum amount of probably very high levels of resistance. I mean, you can get them for 100 rupees, right? An entire course of antibiotic therapy for fluoroquinolone maybe 100 or 200 rupees. And Dhananjay's diagnostic test would probably cost 5 times that, or 4 times that. I don't know what it is, but it's a very strange situation. So I think there are many factors that need to be taken into account, and I think the science of understanding what the UK has very admirably done, I have to say, not just looking at the price of the drug, but actually looking at the overall societal benefit of paying, sort of having a subscription for this product is incredible. Now, is there something that we got to learn from that as to how this product should be priced and what kind of incentives or not that we should provide to developers?
Absolutely fair. I think it has to be looked at from multiple angles, and I think the role of government would be crucial in terms of building, a structure where availability of these solutions are ensured going forward. While there are several priorities, healthcare definitely comes right on top, and I think somebody has to look at all across geographies. I think somebody has to look at the threat of AMR and say, here is what it costs for me to save lives, and I'm going to foot the bill for that.
So I have one suggestion also to just make. Maybe one of the things that the government could do, and which they did very well in COVID, is maybe allow CSR funding to come into AMR. Right? And maybe companies don't know about it, but if that happens, I'm sure many companies will be happy to fund projects related to AMR through their CSR funding. Because many companies I know are also looking at avenues of how these funds can be spent. So you can do charitable work, you can do education. Maybe this is an area also.
Absolutely. Something that I think will definitely keep adding from our platform as well. So thank you for that, Jaideep. So I think for now, I think we are hitting 10:52, and I definitely do not want to take too much of your time right in the morning for a session, but we have a few questions which are available. And if I take few of those, which definitely are aligned very well with some of the points. So I'll take the first question that ever came is from a participant called Sumana. And I'll read it out for now and please see who would like to take that. What efforts are done to reduce the cost of procalcitonin, which is a good marker for effective AMSP?
Yeah, maybe I can take that.
Yeah.
I mean, see, procalcitonin, by the way, is available today even as a lateral flow test with a quantitative readout. So it's not just available in the large labs on the chemiluminescence or whatever, but PCT is available in various point of care platforms already in the market. See, the price question, honestly, is a slightly complex one. It is related very much to volumes and things. So you will find that there's enough of a demand that price can come down. My guess would be that that test today probably is sold at maybe 500-600 rupees, something like that. And the only thing that's preventing it to come down to half of that or lower is if there's volume, people will bring it down. It's not a question of the actual cost of that test. It's not probably that expensive to make.
Fair. No, thank you. Thank you. The another question which has come, and quite a few on diagnostics, but I'm sure both of you can take it. One question which has come just now is that from Ephigenics is antibiotic sensitive test is the gold standard, and I think we all know that. Now they are saying that is it possible to develop specific diagnostics for polybacteria, something that you alluded to, Dhananjay, in your points, and polymechanisms by which bacteria acquire resistance. So I think there's two-pronged question. One is a diagnostics for polymicrobial or polybacterial. And the second is indicating polymechanism by which bacteria acquire infection. So either Jaideep, Dhananjay.
Sorry, what's the question, Taslim?
I'll come again. So is it possible to develop specific diagnostics for polymicrobial? So right now, we know that if it's a polymicrobial, we'll have to do isolation in terms of culture, and then from individual, you'll have to grow it because of complexion, complex. Yeah. So is there a diagnostic which you could be done directly on polymicrobial, or while we do it, you can always run an AST on a polymicrobial. The reason it is not being taken is the complexity by which is not reliable. Outcome would not be reliable because of the complexity it is involved in it, and that's why people isolate it.
Right.
Question is that is there one that you can take on straight away, so you save 16 hours? What I'm trying to possibly I see is that the isolation component can be saved by 16 hours. So is there something that being done, people are trying?
So I think so over here, first of all, let's say you have a sepsis. Ideally, we'd like to start directly from that blood sample of that patient. But as you know, probably you first grow it in a BACTEC or some culture system for a day. And then I think practically speaking, starting from that point is probably what's more possible today rather than starting directly from the sample. I think that's much more complex to do or much more technically challenging to do. But so if you say now from the 24-hour culture you take and then you do a highly multiplex molecular diagnostic, right? You could in theory then identify all of the species as well as the resistances. In fact, one of the things that Achira is doing is actually looking at an approach which is exactly that, where you take that sample, you do a multiplexed amplification followed by a microarray readout, for instance, where you're then able to identify all of these different species, ID resistance genes, and even some of these are SNP-based diagnostics, right? So just a single nucleotide polymorphism we're talking about here. So that kind of an approach is relevant, I would say, in this context. The technical challenges to do these highly multiplex reactions, because it's otherwise difficult to do this as just one amplification or a few amplifications. And like I said, the even more technical challenging one is to start directly from the sample itself, which I think that's probably part B of this problem.
Absolutely. No, thank you for that. A question that possibly I may, Jaideep, you may want to look at just came in from Raghavendra K, which says we recently had seen a patient who was on oral Bactrim after a fracture who may have been non-compliant with his therapy, but I'm reading it as it reads, but who indicates that he is fully adherent to his medications. He was admitted for IV antibiotics, was given IV vancomycin, and was closely followed by orthopedic physician. Should we use code, and this I'm not on top of, but use code Z16.20 and resistance to unspecified antibiotic in this case? It is, you may choose to look at it whichever way, Jaideep. If not, then we can definitely discuss with him later on.
Maybe I have not fully understood the question or what the gentleman is trying to say, but I think we'll pass for now and maybe get it back later.
Absolutely. I think this is very specific, so we'll have to understand before commenting on it. That's what I gather. Last question, if I may take it very, very quickly. And I would just take it from a perspective. There are questions saying that, are there any saliva-based method for pathogen testing in a way, which is, Dhananjay, you may want to quickly answer on that.
Yeah, well, if the pathogen is expected to be in the saliva, then you do a saliva test. But I guess there are several cases where that's not true.
Correct, exactly. And so so if I may just possibly look at now, the all set of things. And if we were to, put together a point for the, audience today, the participants, in terms of how they would look at it. And I'm attempting to now summarize some of the points that we have discussed and, bring the session to a close. And please add to what I'm, weaving it together. I think we all know that the AMR is looming large, as a threat to all of us, to different geographies, and some geographies more than others, and India possibly falls in that category. That is clear. As product developers, what we possibly need to do as a system for product developers is to understand that there is building an AMR or innovation or a product, and then B is that how there are complexities and challenges in terms of making it available and accessible to the larger society. Those are driven by factors which are related to the financing mechanism, the return of investment of sorts, the affordability component by the society, the pricing strategy, the positioning component, the early engagement with the larger system, something that Dhananjay mentioned. Many factors are involved. And I think those factors are crucial for you to, I would say, not only know of, but rather engage with, to ensure that your hard work of product development doesn't possibly return the amount of returns that it was capable of doing in terms of its impact. And those are the different aspects that actually make the difference between a product well developed and product well received. And that is a larger change between the two, according to, and these are very crucial components according to me. So I would say that this is a very important thing. You heard from a pharmaceutical therapeutic perspective, the issues related to how product what are the challenges in making it accessible and available to a larger, use, and from a diagnostic perspective, how things are falling in place. And I think it is time for us to, work on those components in addition to the product development aspect, and ensure that we actually connect with the larger ecosystem players. And I hope some of those points will stay with you all as product developers and help you to take it further. Before I end,
I want to give you one statistic at the end, which came out from a very recent report, very fascinating. If you look at drug development in different therapeutic areas, the highest amount is right now going on in oncology, right? And the success rate of a drug, the success rate of drugs that enter phase 1 to the market is 5 to 6%.
Wow.
If you apply the same thing to antibiotics, if you look at the number of drugs that enter phase 1 and are successful, the success rate is actually 16%. It's the highest in any therapeutic area at the moment.
Fantastic. Fantastic. This is amazing. So funds are there where success is less, and funds are not there where success is not there. So I think this is another way to look at that, right? So very, very stunning, very stunning. 300% difference, and still you don't see funds because of the end of the tunnel. The share prices are going to fall after the product development.
It's. I think, as I said, the pull incentive has to be now as strong as the push, if not stronger.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, very true. Any quick comment from you, Dhananjay, before we close formally?
No, I think probably all of this is leading to we need the governments and policymakers involved as much as all of us scientific, technical company folks, because clearly there's some intervention that is needed at a systemic scale to solve this problem of pricing and affordability. And so, yeah, hopefully more of these interactions will do that thing. And we don't want a COVID-like situation to actually prompt some action. Hopefully we can take some action before that.
Indeed, indeed. And I think we have to be on it, be at it, and engage continuously. And I think this is a responsibility of all players in this, ecosystem. So I think on that particular note, thank you so much for joining both of you, Jaideep and Dhananjay. Very, very insightful, comments and perspectives. Thank you so much. I'm sure this will be very, very useful to the participants today. I'll hand it back to Nandita to take it forward and close it. Thank you.
Thanks, Tasleem. An absolutely fascinating discussion. Many new learnings for me as well. In terms of what goes behind. We just say no about diagnostics and drugs, but what goes behind. And so I'm sure likewise for the participants. And again, would like to thank Dr. Gopte and Dhananjay, Tasleem, you as well, for this very fascinating session. And thanks to Debarshini and Dr. Roshan also, we were able to bring this webinar out today. And just to say that we will be having another session called AMR. We've started a new series called AMR Conversations. The first one will be on June 7th. Of course, we will send out more information. That's a conversation between where we will, Dr. Anand Kumar of Bugworks and Kavita Singh, Dr. Kavita Singh of DNDI will be in conversation with Dr. Tasleem, June 7th. So mark your calendars, we'll send out information soon. And look forward to doing more such, webinars where we can engage with public and sort of spread the message or the importance that we need to urgently curb the menace of AMR. Thank you and see you soon.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.